Mortise and tenon joinery is fundamental to good, sturdy woodworking. In the old-timey days, the mortise would be chopped by hand and the tenon would be cut one cheek at a time with a handsaw. Modern routers have made it much faster to cut mortises, and while machines like the table saw have taken a lot of the elbow grease out of cutting the tenon half of the joint, they still must be cut one cheek at a time, and that leaves room for errors to creep in. But if the mortise is the easier half of the joint, why not cut two mortises and connect them with a loose tenon? Loose tenons are much faster to make. You merely rip a board to the right width at the table saw, round the edges at the router table, and cut it up into short pieces. You can create dozens of tenons in just a few minutes. Now that we've simplified tenons, let's turn our attention back to those mortises. If you have several to make in a single project, it pays to spend a couple of minutes and a few scraps to create a custom jig. Here we've cut some scraps of plywood. The larger pieces are about 6 or 8 inches by 3 or 4 inches. Their exact size isn't important, but the thin strips in the center are important. They're exactly as wide as the bushing you've installed on your router. Doesn't matter what size that bushing is, just make the center strips in your jig the same width. Next, determine the rough length you wish your mortise to be. This isn't an exact science. Just be sure it's shorter than the end of your narrowest workpiece that you wish to use the jig on. Keep in mind, as you glue your jig together, that the actual mortise you're going to cut will be slightly shorter than the space you've just created due to the offset created by the bushing surrounding your router bit. Fight the desire to get out your calculator and figure out how much that offset is. It doesn't matter because the exact length of the mortise doesn't matter. Now we have to attach our fence to our jig. Place the plate you just assembled on top of your workpiece and center the hole by eye. Now scribe a line with a pencil on the underside of that plate along the edge of your workpiece to indicate where your fence will be mounted. It is critical that this line be parallel to the mortise. If it's off, your mortises will be crooked and you'll have all sorts of assembly issues. The easiest way to ensure that that line is parallel is to replace the line with a kerf you cut at the table saw. This is accurate because we know the edge of the plate is parallel to the edge of the mortise, and the table saw fence will ensure that the kerf will be as well. The distance of that kerf from the mortise isn't that important. We just eyeballed it when we drew the pencil line. So don't stress over that when you cut your kerf. All that matters is the kerf is parallel to the mortise. Now get yourself another scrap of wood. Raise the table saw blade and skim the edge, leaving a tongue that will fit into that kerf. It'll only take a couple of passes, slowly raising the blade until the tongue fits perfectly. What you've created is a fence that will self-align with the mortise as you attach it to the jig, securing it with screws. That's it for the jig. Let's cut some mortises. Lay your work pieces together as they will be assembled with the show faces up. Here we're making a door, which is a perfect project for this type of joinery. Draw lines across the center of each joint. These lines will help you position your jig. So use a square to extend them around the edge or end where your mortise will actually be cut. Notice how we've also drawn a line at the center of the jig's mortise opening. This line can be aligned with the center line on your workpiece, and the jig is clamped in place. It's important that the jig's fence is always placed on the outer face of the workpiece. That's why it doesn't matter if the mortise hole was perfectly centered on the edge of the workpiece when we laid out the position of the fence. As long as you always place that fence on the outer show face of every workpiece, everything will line up perfectly. You should have no problem keeping track of which are the show faces because that's where you drew those center lines earlier. So the jig always covers those lines. I recommend an upcut spiral router bit. I'll link to the one I use below this video. Upcut bits will help pull the chips up out of the mortise, keeping the bit cooler so it'll last longer. However, you still have to take several shallow passes, going about 1/4 inch deeper with each one. And if you're cutting a large, deep mortise, you may still have issues clearing chips unless you pause and vacuum them out from time to time. Remember, clearing those chips are essential to keeping your bit cool and sharp. If you're getting a lot of vibration as you make each pass, you may change your tactics. Instead of moving the router sideways through each cut, plunge the bit repeatedly downward to full depth, boring a series of overlapping holes down the length of the mortise. This is my favorite method, especially when cutting deep mortises. Once most of the waste is gone, you can clean things up with a final pass across the mortise's length at full depth. After you cut your first mortise, you'll know how wide to cut that loose tenon stock without having to calculate for that bushing offset. Remember, tenon stock is cut in long pieces, which are then cross-cut into many loose tenons. It's not a bad idea to actually cut your tenon stock narrower than the length of the mortise. This gives you room to adjust the position of the assembled workpieces in case you don't position your jig perfectly on your center line, or if you just want to make an adjustment during assembly. The strength of the joint is in all the glue surface on the faces of the loose tenon. It will not be weakened if the tenon is narrower than the mortise's length. And that's all there is to it. Loose tenon joinery is easy to make, it's super strong, and now you know how to do it too. Try it out in your next project. Featherboards improve the quality and safety of table saw and router table cuts, if you use them. Hedgehog featherboards are designed to be easier to use. With a single knob and one-handed operation for quick adjustments, there are no more excuses. Check them out at the link below this video. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.